It's a pleasure to welcome you here this morning for a conversation on a very important topic, which is the agricultural sector in the era of bioeconomy. I wanted to thank very much Geraldo Martha, the coordinator of Embrapa's Scientific Cooperation Program in the United States, Embrapa Labex USA, for having been a driving force behind this, organizing this event. And the topic, as I mentioned, is the idea of the bioeconomy, a section of the economy based on renewable biological resources from agriculture to pharmaceutical and biotech, which has gained the interest of policymakers and the private sector alike in recent years. A strong, innovative, and sustainable bioeconomy is increasingly seen as indispensable part of the solution to many global challenges, from food security to climate change. And especially on those two, Brazil is a major actor, along with the United States and other major nations. We were commenting before, Brazil is known in international studies as a soft power. On climate and on food production, Brazil is pretty much hard power, has really and has accident of power on both. And since one of our missions here at the Brazil Institute of Wilson Center is do the utmost to bring together or highlight convergences between Brazil and the United States, the two largest democracies in this hemisphere, it's especially thrilling to host this event. We have 5 speakers. I think I only see 4 right now. They are. I will just introduce them by their titles. They are highly accomplished people. They are all doctors in their respective fields. And they occupy very important positions in companies and in government. Mauricio Lopes, the president of Embrapa, who will speak on Brazilian agriculture in the era of bioeconomy. Barry O'Keefe, who is the chief of the Molecular Targets Program and chief of the Natural Products Branch at National Cancer Institute at NIH, who I hope joins us in a moment. Ibrahim Shakir, Associate Deputy Administration of International and Emerging Issues at USDA. He will focus on innovation and regulation in new breeding technologies, the USDA regulatory approach. Neil Gutterson, Chief Technology Officer at Corteva AgriScience, at the Agricultural Division of Dow DuPont, and Neil and Mauricio just signed moments ago an agreement, a cooperation agreement between Embrapa and Corteva. It's very important. And last but not least, our dear friend, collaborator, personal friend and collaborator of many, many years with the Brazil Institute, actually Marcos Young, CEO of Asia-Brazil Agro Alliance, who actually, Marcos is one of the reasons we were able to build the Brazil Institute over the past decade. He is a professor. He's from our University of São Paulo, the famous ESALC that we love in Piracicaba. Also, Geraldo is from there. And Marcos will talk about value chains, trade, and U.S.-Brazil role on global food security. And with that, Geraldo, can we go straight to, or if you want to say something?
Really like to thank you, your presence here. I think that we are going to have a very exciting discussion in terms of bioeconomy. I just would like to add that one common trace in terms of Brazilian and U.S. agriculture is exactly they have a strong foundation on science. Both countries, they have their agriculturals based on science. A quick example for Brazil, 68% of the Brazilian agricultural product is already dependent on technology. So because of this strength in the agricultural sector, and when we think that the production of biomass is the basis for this bioeconomy, we are very keen to see some of the opportunities for bioeconomy in Brazil because of this huge opportunity. And once again, thank you very much for being here and joining us in this discussion.
Okay, thank you, Geraldo. I'll invite Mauricio Lopes then to start us off. Mauricio, the floor is yours.
Excellent. Good morning. First of all, to thank you, Paulo, for the support to this event. Congratulate you for the excellent work you've been developing here with the Brazil Institute and the Wilson Center. Also to thank Geraldo, who was important for the organization of the event. My compliments to my colleagues here, Marcos, Ibrahim, and Neil. It's great to be here with you to discuss a little bit about how Brazilian agriculture is dialoguing or connecting to this emerging new economy that we call bioeconomy. A low carbon, low impact, an economy based in solutions coming from the natural world, the biology. So am I allowed to break the protocol and stand near the slide? Do I have a microphone there? Can I use yours? I'll feel more comfortable if I stand here. Yep. So what I want to tell you first is that Brazil is already in the bioeconomy. We are basically exiting a huge first revolution in our agriculture that started 40 years ago. 40 years ago, Brazil was not a food-secure country. We were importing food. With that huge natural resource base, we didn't know exactly how to deal with the challenges of farming in the tropical belt of the world. You see in this map that basically all of our territory is in the tropical belt. The most challenging environments for farming are here. This slide shows the concentration of poor and acidic soils around the world. You see that in the tropical belt we have the poorest soils on Earth. High aluminum, low phosphorus, low fertility. So it was very difficult for us to overcome that because in the 70s, Brazil didn't have a model of agriculture for the tropical belt to adapt or to copy. Brazil had to develop its own science-based agricultural model. We invested a lot in institutions, in training, in capacity building, and that helped Brazil to become a food and an energy security country in the short time span of 40 years. And also helped Brazil to move towards something that was not discussed 40 years ago, or 30 or 20 years ago, this bioeconomy, bio-based, low-impact, low-carbon agriculture. I'll show you this. Our organization had an important impact on this. It was not alone on this. We had the universities, we had the state research institutes, more recently the private sector, investing a lot in research and innovation for tropical agriculture. If I can tell you in a nutshell what Brazil was able to do with the so-called science-based agriculture for the tropics, it's in this slide. We've been able to transform our acidic and poor soils in fertile land. We understood the difficulties of our soils, and we've been able to overcome that. We've been able to tropicalize crops and animal production systems, and we've been able to develop a platform of sustainable practices and public policies which helped to transform the Brazilian landscape for agriculture. Building fertility. You see here a natural soil farmed with soybeans and the soil fertility that was built. You see the difference, the huge difference. We studied and then understood the limitations in fertility of our soils, like phosphorus. Phosphorus is a tricky thing in tropical soils. Tropical soils like to immobilize phosphorus, so we had to learn how to manage the fertility and how to manage this nutrient in tropical areas. And we did a lot in adapting and tropicalizing crops to Brazil. Soybean is the most important case. You see here the coverage of the soybean crop in 1974, and you see it now in 2016. Soybean gained practically all parts of the Brazilian territory that can be farmed sustainably. Corn, the same. Corn moved fast from the south to the tropical area, and we are right now doing it with wheat, which is our last frontier. Brazil still imports half of the wheat it consumes, but wheat, as you can see, is fast moving to the tropical area, and this will be also a huge impact, not only for Brazil, but for all the tropical belt of the world. So the dissemination of conservation practices also helped a lot. This is already Brazil in the bioeconomy. The minimum tillage is a huge revolution in Brazil. Reduced erosion, helped us to save water, incorporate carbon in the soil. So most of our areas are farmed today with protection for the soil with minimum tillage. And this was maybe the biggest jump of Brazil in the bioeconomy. Nitrogen fixation in soybeans. Look at these numbers. We calculated this last season, Brazil cultivated around 35 million hectares of soybeans. All soybeans in Brazil are grown with nitrogen fixation by rhizobia. The use of rhizobia last year helped Brazil save $13 billion for not being necessary to use the nitrogen fertilizer, and saved also 62 million tons of CO2 equivalent of emissions. Because if you add the chemical form of nitrogen, you have emissions which are very nasty. And new products gaining ground, new bioproducts. Embrapa just released this microorganism, Azospirillum brasiliense, that is helping Brachiaria, which is the most important pasture species in Brazil. We cultivate around 180 million hectares of Brachiaria, and it gives a tremendous boost in the root of Brachiaria, helping this species to acquire nutrients, to incorporate more carbon in the soil. So new bioproducts gaining ground and gaining space and helping our agriculture to become more sustainable. It is common in Brazil already to ship biocontrol agents to farmers. This is a company, a spin-off from the University of São Paulo, FAPESP. They just pack and ship biocontrol agents to farmers. So this is a strategy that is gaining and ground all over the country. And we have bioethanol as maybe the most important result of the bioeconomy for our economy, for Brazil. Brazil has one of the most balanced energy matrix in the world. 41.2% is pastures like this that can become high productivity pastures like this, releasing the pressure on forested areas, increasing the productivity of our beef production, and releasing land for more crops. That's the way the agriculture in Brazil will grow. Also, this is a revolution, what we call sustainable intensification of the land. By using new technologies like short cycle soybeans, we can plant soybeans in November, December, harvest them in January, February, plant corn together with pastures in February, harvest corn in June. Harvesting corn, we have a pasture ready to be grazed. So you have a first crop of soybeans, a second crop of corn, a third crop of beef, and then you start over again. So this is reaching already 14 million hectares in Brazil of combined systems of integrated systemic agriculture in the country. And we are also adding trees to this system. Adding tree help a lot to incorporate carbon in the system and help us develop a model of carbon-free production, as I'll show you a few images showing how this thing is growing. This is a pasture combined with a forest. You see here you have shading. Shading is important in the tropics because the animals suffer a lot when you don't have shading. So by adding shading, you are taking care of animal welfare. People want food also labeled as food produced in safe and good conditions also for the animals. So this crop livestock system is really giving us the opportunity to develop a new mode of production in Brazil. Low carbon, low impact, animal welfare taken care of. We are developing at Embrapa metrics to measure all the impacts on this, how much carbon is being incorporated, how much energy is reaching the ground, what is the impact on the pasture, the radiation that is being incorporated in the ground and by the trees, the amount of carbon that is being incorporated. Because of these metrics that we have developed, Embrapa already has a procedure that is helping farmers and companies in Brazil to certify beef as carbon neutral beef. This is the seal. We already have all the procedures to help our farmers to develop their production systems and to label their products as low carbon. Obviously, we can do this for milk, we can do this for fish and other things. As we develop a more systemic agricultural production system, we have metrics that will allow us to move quick into a low impact, low carbon, and more sustainable systems. Good news is that there are new sciences coming that will help us to move even faster with new possibilities. In the past, we had genetics, statistics, chemistry, engineering. So this is the toolbox that we use traditionally to drive agriculture forward. Now we have this new toolbox. We just signed an agreement with Corteva, looking for new possibilities in gene addition, big data. So all the new tools that digital transformation is bringing to us. So we are really very positive and very happy with the possibilities that all these new technologies bring to us. Also, there is a huge revolution here in this field of entrepreneurship. Lots of young people taking all this knowledge, all these new technologies, all these new platforms to help us generate solutions and answers to agriculture in the tropics in a faster and in a more efficient way. So in summary, this is our big agenda for the future, taking advantage of all the multifunctional power of agriculture. Agriculture is one of the most multifunctional activities that we humans developed. If we take full advantage of all this multifunctionality, I'm sure that we can give a great contribution to the world. This multifunctional capacity is connected to many objectives in the Agenda 2030. So we want to do just that, to help Brazil move quickly to the end of 2030 in good shape and well prepared for the next jump to 2050. Certainly we will have many huge challenges to face, but if we get here in good shape, I think we will be better able to jump also in an efficient and an intelligent way in the direction of 2050. So in a nutshell, it's a bit of what we are doing. We consider that Brazil is already in the bioeconomy, the new paradigm of development. We are trying to do our best, and with all the new tools, with the all new knowledge that is available, I think we can do a lot more. So we are very positive that we are in the right, moving in the right direction. It's great to be here with you. Thank you again, Paulo. It's been really great, this opportunity.
Thank you very much.
CyanoByron.
agenda, and I'll invite Barry now to, you have a,
I have it. Talk on a flash drive here. And again, my apologies for being late. We seem to have a few fewer roads this morning in Frederick than we had last night. And so it took about an extra hour to get down here. You'll find it if you go by most recent. It should be the top one.
This one wasn't centered.
Yes, number 2. Thank you. Do I need to use this?
sure.
Yeah, okay. Oh, and thank you. Okay. Thank you very much for inviting me here. I appreciate the opportunity to tell you a little bit about what we're doing in collaboration with some researchers in Brazil. It was my honor, to go down to Brazil last year and visit. I'm also part of the natural products branch of the NCI, chief of that branch, and we have several memos of understanding with different universities in Brazil for collaboratory agreements to encourage research into natural products and take advantage of the biodiversity and help Brazilian researchers take advantage of their own biodiversity. So to move along, what I'll talk about today is kind of my personal area of research, which is looking at biotherapeutics from natural product extracts. And so at the Natural Products Repository in the NCI, we have approximately 230,000 extracts. So these are aqueous and organic extracts from natural products. And these are available to researchers worldwide. Those in Brazil, those in any country can request them and have access to them. We send them out for free. All they have to do is pay for shipping, and they can get plated extracts to screen. I should also let you know we have a new initiative going on where we are actually pre-fractionating or partially purifying these extracts. It's a large enterprise, so we're creating a new 1 million fraction library of partially purified natural products, which will start becoming available to researchers in January of next year. One of the things that traditional natural products chemists always do is they look at the small organic soluble components of these extracts. And for 150 years, they have been successful in producing many drugs. Approximately 30% of all approved drugs by the FDA are based on natural product pharmacophores. In the case of cancer, that number increases to 50 to 60% of all approved drugs were based on a natural product originally, and the equivalent number for antimicrobial drugs as well. However, these chemists working on the small organic soluble molecules like this have largely neglected for the last 100 years the biotherapeutics that are present also. There are proteins and peptides that are available in these extracts that basically have been thrown away by researchers for 100 years. And so rather than climb to the highest top of a mountain or look for an extreme environment to perhaps find natural products, we thought maybe we should just look at what people have been throwing away. And so we've identified many proteins over the years. To give you an idea of what we're talking with, why we would be interested in biotherapeutics, if we take a look, here's Taxol. This is what everyone would think of as a classic natural product, has saved millions of lives, complex structure, lots of chirality. But if we compare that to the protein I'm going to talk about today, CyanoByron, that's the structure of CyanoByron. And if we look at Taxol, there it is. So the size and complexity of structure available in biotherapeutics allows you to have interactions that are unavailable to smaller organic soluble molecules. They allow you to affect and perturb different parts of protein-protein interactions or infectious disease agents and target cells that you would not be able to productively do with something this small. And this complexity, or what I would like to call an expansion of pharmacological space, allows you a lot of opportunities. And because most researchers haven't worked in this area, it's been very successful. So if we look also, can these get into the clinic? When I first started working with these, people were like, these can never be drugs. We had review committees come in and say, the NCI should get rid of me. These will never be drugs. It's too high risk. It can't work. And in those days, they had points. But there have been so much research and work done on peptide therapeutics in general over the last 20 years that this is not the hurdle that people think it is as far as immunogenicity and potential anaphylaxis and other components. So if we take a look there, for example, there is an approved drug in 2005. This is a peptide taken from Gila monster spit. Essentially the saliva of Gila monster. They isolated this peptide. It's used clinically approved on a once-a-week injection, and this is for type 2 diabetes. We also have calcitonin, which is taken from salmon brain. This is used for osteoporosis. And again, this is clinically used, it's systemically used, and it's available worldwide now. And of course, okay, sorry, you have people elsewhere. Usually I have my soccer coach voice. It usually carries well enough. And of course, there's Botox. So this is a foreign protein injected into people millions of times every year. It's been used for years. It doesn't cause anaphylaxis. So there's clear evidence of clinical efficacy for biotherapeutics and their utility. So I don't have to make the argument of why the NCI should keep me around as much as I used to. But I have been lucky over the years. I've been able to work on many different classes of antiviral and anti-cancer proteins from natural product extracts. And I will say that because most people haven't worked on these for years, about 80% of all the proteins we identify are brand new, even with all the sequencing and all the genomic sequencing that's present now and available. If you do a BLAST search, and we've identified numerous classes, about 80% of everything we identify has no homology to anything in the BLAST database. So these are novel structures, novel interactions, and as I mentioned, expand on what's known of pharmacological space. Today, what I want to talk about is this protein, CyanoByron, I apologize, that expanded on this particular computer. This is an antiviral protein that was originally isolated from a cyanobacteria, and that was collected in Hawaii. So it was produced and initially found to be anti-HIV active. We were able to produce small quantities in E. coli, and it was put forward as a potential anti-HIV microbicide. This is a major World Health Organization priority into getting a female-controlled antiviral, anti-HIV microbicide that women could use themselves to protect themselves from HIV infection. This, as we would say in pharmaceutical industry, is a heavy lift. You have to have a lot of safety involved with any agent that could be used in such a manner, and there are a lot of requirements for that. So usually when I talk to microbicide meetings, everyone has a big list of all the things you have to do to be a successful microbicide, and you can see them shown here. And CyanoByron, I'm not going to go into detail. There have been over 200 papers now published on CyanoByron. All of these have been equally and published on, and they've all been successfully done, except this last one here, until just recently. CyanoByron was difficult to produce in E. coli. We couldn't get high yields. Yeast didn't work for it as well because yeast systems produce high mannins. High mannins bind specifically to CyanoByron, so you could produce it in large quantities, but it would get bound up and you couldn't purify it. So there was no good production system, and this was inhibiting the ability to take this to the clinic because you have to have cost-effective production to be able to produce microbicides for the population worldwide that's going to need them. And so that became a big issue. Now, this has shown efficacy in animal models multiple times and has shown the ability. So this was really a hindrance. And so fortunately, I was able to work. Yes, this is the problem right here. So fortunately, I was able to work with Embrapa on this. And I just put this in here to point out that even back in 2000, when we first presented on CyanoByron at the microbicides meeting, the first microbicides meeting, it was brought up that basically there is no way women in developing countries are going to be able to afford the cost of a microbicide. Even in those days, in the earliest days, we had that meeting and there were pharmaceutical industry there and they were saying this needs to be a billion-dollar market. You need to give us something that's going to be safe and through all this or we're not going to be able to develop it. And those costs for a recombinant protein were just not acceptable. So then, took many years, but ran into Libio. Libio called me from Embrapa, and we were able to work together. And so what he had proposed, we had previously made CyanoByron in tobacco plants with collaborators in England. It had been made in hairy root cultures and hydroponically. But in each case, it was very low yielding, and there are some limitations to those technologies. I'll mention a little more on the last slide. But working with Libio, he was able to genetically engineer soybeans specifically to produce CyanoByron in the seeds. We showed clearly that it was only in the seeds, that it was equally efficacious to the material that had been produced in E. coli and from the native source. And importantly, we were able to take these soybean seeds and process them for soybean oil through normal industrial processing take the crushed dried material that was left over, just bring it up in phosphate buffered saline, and the antiviral protein would come into solution and was fully active. If you looked at the oil from the soybean, it was exactly the same as control. There were no differences in content. There was no CyanoByron in the oil fraction that was produced by that. So we could get a second product out of the same soybean at the same time. Now, to be honest, what was left over after we brought the antiviral protein into solution was still proteinaceous material that could be used for another thing, whether it was fertilizer or what. With GMO concerns and things like that, there might be concerns of how one would use that. But it would be possible to get a third product potentially out of that protein fraction. So when we first published this and I sent it to PNAS, they said, you should not make things in food crops. This should not be done. It was basically very similar to what I would get in the lay press. You should just not do this. Not that the science was bad, not that the protein was bad. But we ended up publishing this in Plant Biotechnology Journal, and it immediately was featured in Science Magazine as one of their editor's choices. And it's been in the top 5% of all papers for attention since that time. And so this was very well received, and I should point out also just recently, we also won the Federal Technology Transfer Award for this. So this is the Federal Laboratories Consortium of all of the discoveries and collaborations in the entire federal government, and which are most important on a yearly basis and featured. And this particular one, this collaboration between us and Alibio and Embrapa and our other partners in South Africa won for the development of large-scale production of CyanoByron, won this award this year. This is more important than I knew when I first won it because I wasn't familiar with the award, but it actually does go to the Congress of the United States as being an important output from federal government research. And so I think Embrapa and we are certainly, I think, legitimately proud of this achievement. We were able to make enough CyanoByron in a small greenhouse to provide 1 million doses to people. And so it's entirely possible to do this. So CyanoByron is important for its anti-HIV activity. It is moving forward clinically on that, but it also has activity against numerous other viruses. It's been tested and there's been shown animal efficacy against hepatitis C, also against HSV, another sexually transmitted disease. We've also seen activity against the Ebola virus if you inject it into animals. It's been administered intranasally for influenza and was able to protect animals from mortality from influenza, including H5N1s. And so there's a broad potential antiviral utility for this protein. Much of this was inhibited by the lack of being able to have a low-cost production stream that could allow people to produce this in the future. So why is this particular protein active against all these? Well, it turns out that CyanoByron binds to specific oligosaccharides that are present on the surface envelope glycoproteins. And these proteins from these different viruses all have similar fusion mechanisms. If you look at the structures here, you can see these alpha helical fusion peptides. What happens is you have a domain on top that is normally heavily glycosylated to prevent antibodies from binding to it and prevent host autoimmune response to it. And when that is engaged productively with a cell, it opens up and the fusion peptides allow these different viruses to infect cells. What CyanoByron does, and similar lectins, they bind to oligosaccharides that decorate the top of this, and they sterically prevent the conformational changes that allow these fusion peptides to infect cells. And so they block that. And so something targeted like CyanoByron is allows broad antiviral activity against numerous agents, which is something that is highly desired. So currently, we have continuing collaborations for large-scale production of CyanoByron in South Africa, Brazil, Spain, England. Since this paper was published, another paper was published showing that the production of CyanoByron in rice. We have, as I mentioned, more than 200 papers published on this particular protein, another 10 in the last couple of years. It just keeps on going. There's also been new versions of CyanoByron that are engineered to have enhanced biophysical properties and activity. And there's also currently in the United States a probiotic where they actually made a lactobacillus that can secrete CyanoByron and actually are looking to use that as a probiotic for women and has shown activity in macaques where it can actually colonize the vaginal canal of macaques and show long-term protection against multiple challenges with HIV. And finally, we have additional activity going on with our colleagues in Brazil that are testing CyanoByron now against dengue, yellow fever, Zika, and other potential agents which might have activity. So there's a lot of continuing work. I just wanted to kind of finish with some general comments on biofarming, as they call it, with a PH, or production of biopharmaceuticals. One, when I first published this, we had folks from the USDA come and call me rather quickly and say, you have to be very careful about what you're doing. And they were serious, and they had a good point, because we're producing a foreign protein in a food crop. And there, you know, though this is important, and anti-HIV activity is important, microbicides very important, it's also billions and billions of dollars of food crop economy that is potentially at risk if something like this is done in an inappropriate manner. And so we had to make sure, for example, we didn't have any viable seeds in the United States and things like that. Things were crushed in Brazil before we worked on them here. But I wanted to point out that for, you know, resource-challenged countries especially, a seed production format for biopharmaceuticals is vitally important. When you produce in tobacco, and I collaborate with a lot of people who do, you have to treat the tobacco plants, harvest them within 2 weeks, and process them quickly because they will degrade, you'll lose your protein. You also have toxic alkaloids and other components that must be purified away before they're able to be used. When you use a seed crop, such as soy and rice that we have done, you can dry that seed and store it indefinitely. These proteins are very stable. They can be stored for years. So that eases the production stream and the resource requirements to be able to produce this for countries. And so that's an important advantage. However, as I mentioned, the production, if you contaminated food sources with proteins being produced, antiviral or otherwise, that could be damaging to the economy of these countries. So I really think it's incumbent upon us, both the funding organizations and the regulatory agents and those who are interested in this research, to kind of identify, encourage research in a lower profile seed crop or seed crops that can be easily identified as being those that contain biopharmaceuticals, and encourage the engineering of those so that we can get the advantages of seed production as far as cost, stability, and long-term production efficiencies, but not have the risks we have to majority food crops like corn and soy and others. So this was interesting. For example, if you had a soy that was a rare breed that was a different color seed, so you could easily see if it was in the food crop, and that was the one that produced CyanoByron, I think that would assuage a lot of people's concerns about that. And so while I'm very interested and think it's very important to produce these biopharmaceuticals in agricultural means, I also recognize that this is a substantial risk to the agricultural economy that is built around the food items from these countries, and that we have to be aware of that as we go forward. And so with that, I'll end my talk and just like to thank all of the collaborators at Embrapa and within the United States government and elsewhere who have helped do all the work on CyanoByron over the years. I could probably fill several slides if I included everyone on all the papers, but these are the folks that were involved with the data I showed you today. And thank you for your attention. And again, my apologies for being late.
Okay.
Do you have a PowerPoint?
I believe I do.
Here already?
Well,
Yes, it's already
okay,
loaded.
so I guess everyone's standing, I might as well.
Great, very, very nice.
All right. I guess we're shifting gears. Maybe there's a way to transition here. Again, my name is Ibrahim Shakir. I'm with the U.S. Department of Agriculture. I'm with the Animal and Plant Health Inspection Agency Services with USDA. I spent many years with the Agricultural Research Service. That's how I got to work with Mauricio and Geraldo and Alex, and through their collaborative work that's going on with USDA Agricultural Service for 20 years. And it's been a wonderful ongoing collaboration that really resulted in wonderful, great advancement in science and agriculture. So I left the Agricultural Research Service and assumed the position with APHIS, and particularly with the Biotechnology Regulatory Services. So I left the research side, but coming to the regulatory side. And it has been interesting. So I will, okay. So if so, we basically, if you're not aware of, some of you might know, but many of you may not know, that genetically engineered plants are basically, there's an oversight that where 3 agencies maintain that kind of coordinated effort to have that oversight. So with the FDA and EPA, and both FDA is the safe for use in food and feed, EPA for the safe for use and pesticide, and we basically USDA APHIS protects plant health. And through this coordinated framework, we highly coordinated, and we try to maintain provide good effort to maintaining and ensuring safe use for our public. And with that, I will, how is it? Okay. So today I would like to talk about, because this whole area of the bioeconomy and innovation and so on and so forth, my focus, I decided to talk about the plant breeding innovations, the current USDA APHIS biotech regulations, consideration for future USDA APHIS approach, and some of you might have read the USDA Statement on plant breeding innovations. So at USDA APHIS, we use the term plant breeding innovations that for this newer DNA modification techniques such as genome editing used to develop plant varieties. And many other countries use the term new plant breeding techniques, NPBTs. And that basically includes the genome editing techniques such as CRISPR-Cas9, TALEN, and Zinfringer. TALEN and Zinfringer is the oldest kind of techniques of genome editing, and the latest is CRISPR-Cas9, but there's others that are probably developing as we speak. And these techniques provide tremendous advancement and help for to increase precision in agriculture breeding and greater efficiency, speeds things up quickly, maybe half of the time in many cases. So the way APHIS itself, USDA, we really don't have genetically like a GE kind of biotechnology regulatory in place, but what the authority that we have is a Plant Protection Act of 2000. Within that, we regulate the movement of regulated articles such as importation, interstate movement, environmental release, which is confined. And with that, you have to have 2 criteria for us to do that, where you have, the organism has to be a living organism, and the 2 criteria will be genetically engineered and plant pest involved, where we have a donor as a recipient. And so with that, I'd like to remind you that not all genetically engineered products come to us, or that can be regulated under our as part of their GE products. We have, and in order to make that process as efficient as possible, we created a mechanism, what we call a regulated mechanism, where developers can just send us a letter and explaining their product and what they're about to do in that particular product as they hope to develop, and we can basically provide them an answer if they're going to be regulated or not. So to date, we have received, let me go back, we have received, this number 62 is probably, now we have 64 letters that we have answered. I will say about 20 letters from the 64 now or so, there basically has to do with related to to genome editing techniques. And these are a couple of examples of the genetically, where CRISPR or where genome editing was used, and this waxy corn and the soybean with higher oleic acids. And these were a couple of the products that were not regulated by APHIS. So when we respond to these letters, and just to explain to you, it's a process where under the on my regulated process, we really devote much time in answering these inquiries that come to us, and we post these with obviously some exceptions where CBI is consideration will be redacted. We have to basically, we publish the letters we receive as well as our response. And you could basically go to this website, and we can provide you the link later, and you can view the letters and the response to some of these inquiries. Okay? So we have basically, been thinking about our regulatory framework and how we want to rethink and have some kind of approach that can help us with the ongoing evolvement and development in science, and also rely on our 30 or so years of experience. We have been doing this since 1987. We have vast experience in some of these regulations, and understanding the science. We basically, when it comes to these genome-edited products, some of them, there is no scientific evidence or unique risk to plant health of using genome editing techniques to modify plants. And also, it's also impractical and necessary to regulate plants created through many of the plant breeding innovations, techniques, including genome editing. And so we have to have that kind of thinking and discussions internally and with our stakeholders, and also with our international partners, to ensure that we are basically communicating and coming up with plans to move forward as we have to basically ensure that our regulatory system in agreements with that is basically science-based. And so we're so now, as a result of that kind of thinking, the department, the Secretary of Agriculture, Secretary Sonny Perdue, announced or gave a statement on this on plant breeding innovations, and particularly because of there's so much interest nationally and internationally to find out exactly the world was looking into the U.S. for some kind of position on this issue. And so there was a statement that was published on March 28th. You could find it online. That statement basically does not change the existing APHIS USDA biotech regulations as 7 CFR Part 340. And it states basically many of the genome-edited plants do not meet the regulation criteria to be subject to this regulation. However, there are some genome-edited plants do meet criteria if they were developed with the use of DNA sequences from plant pests. Also, if a plant pest was used as the vector agent using agrobacterium. And so, and the statement basically considers revising its biotech regulation if it does not intend to regulate, and it will not and does not intend to regulate plants whose DNA is modified by deletions, single base pair substitutions, insertions from sexually compatible plant relatives, or complete nil segregants. As long as the modified plants are developed without the use of plant pests as a donor or vector agent, and the plant species is not itself a plant pest. It's a kind of straightforward right now, but we hope to this provided some clarity about the regulatory treatment of plant breedings, innovations, and the techniques like genome editing have an enormous, as I stated earlier, potential to solve agricultural challenges and benefit to global food security. And some of these products, they soon will be in the marketplace, and we have to have coordinated kind of communication to ensure that these are basically safe and there are no issues concerning trade disruptions and so on and so forth, and also provide clarity and convergence which is important for our trading partners to have this kind of communications and reassurance. Some countries such as Brazil, Chile, Argentina already have a position, but the US actually publishes the finding of, and the decisions on some of these plant breeding innovations when using genome editing. And it's available to the public to read. So the next steps will basically continue to engage with and work with our domestic stakeholders and international stakeholders, and stress the benefits of common international regulatory approach, maintain science-based approach for plant breeding innovations, and to clarify current USDA regulations and rationale for any potential changes, and which we have started the process of communicating that, and I'm going to consider this as basically one event that we have as part of our outreach. So thank you very much again for the organizers, and to see, it's a wonderful opportunity to see my friends here from the Embrapa, and I look forward to further discussions. Thank you.
We'll hear now from you, public-private partnership,
Thank you. Well, I feel like I've been set up very well with Mauricio's perspectives on the Brazilian agricultural economy and capabilities, which is spectacular, and also the perspectives on genome editing, what we call targeted breeding. So I'll come back to a little bit about that later. What I want to talk about really is a bit about Corteva, what our approach is to serve agriculture of the future, and really, if you think about the bioeconomy from the agricultural side, the heart of it all is the farmer. And at Corteva, the farmer is our most fundamental focus and purpose in serving the farmer and helping the farmer improve his or her livelihood. So Corteva is a division of Dow DuPont. We are the result of a merger that closed less than 9 months ago. Within about a year, we expect to be a public company. So you can think about Corteva as a new company that is going to spin out as a startup, a very large startup in the future. We spent some time as we put the company together to think about what our purpose should be, and this is the purpose statement for our new business. And as you can see, at the heart of it is enriching lives of farmers, but also thinking about who the farmer serves. So as a new company, we have actually taken a little more forward look, I would say, through the farmer to the consumer and what the consumer needs from the farmer in the context of producing a healthy food supply and delivering that food supply in a healthier way for the planet. And you can see that the last part in terms of sustainability, the farmer's interest in ensuring that that farm is preserved for the future generations that comes out of that farming family, but also for the future generations of the planet. So Corteva came together, as I said, from Dow and DuPont, this merger. We actually brought together 3 different business segments, the Dow AgroScience business, the DuPont Crop Protection business, and the DuPont Pioneer business. And you can see on the left the sort of split between seeds and crop protection. We're a pretty unique company today in having a very balanced set of tools and products to serve the farmer. We will be, this year in 2018, close to a $15 billion division and business to come. And you can see we serve most countries around the world. We have a series of crops that we breed and chemicals that we produce to help the farmer preserve and protect the value of the crop that they produce. And you can see we operate quite globally from the map below. So again, the foundation for us is thinking about the food supply and the needs of the consumer in the food supply of the future. So these are some of the really interesting forces and trends that we know are driving changes in agriculture to serve this food supply. So you can look at the top left at 11 o'clock, and clearly health and safety is really critical. This confluence between agriculture and nutrition and health is even more apparent than ever before. We also have a world in the developing world where you see in the US this notion of free from food sources, looking for cleaner labels, and the idea that the average consumer would like to have a food that has one thing on the label, you know, food, and not a lot else on that label. And so that's part of what the consumer wants. Of course, the consumer wants to know that we're responsible, that we're protecting the environment, and that's, of course, very important to us, that we deliver food supply with reduced waste, and that there's a greater interest than ever before, and I've been in this industry for almost 40 years now, in, and it's surprising to me, actually, that consumers really want to understand the origin of their food. Where does it come from? Even to the point of what part of Iowa was my corn produced on? Was this tomato produced in a greenhouse? What was used to produce it? I mean, knowing the food story is an important part of what we need to serve, and we serve farmers and their need to serve the consumers along these lines. Now, not only is that an important landscape, but the farmer is changing. And this slide is meant to give you a little sense of how we see the next generation of farmers that is emerging, certainly in the US, but I think it's very much reflective of what's happening around the world. So this is maybe looking out 10 or 20 years. If you think today about the average farmer, let's just say, I think large farmers in Brazil, large farmers in the US, the average age in the US of a farmer is about 58, and it's typically, in this country, a white male. And that's changing. So I think we're going to see in the next 5 to 10 years a bimodal distribution, where with younger farmers, whereas some of the older farmers continue to age out. And as we look out 10 or 15 or 20 years, we're going to see a much younger farmer who is much more technically savvy and much more gender diverse, and more diverse when you think globally entirely. And so you can see, I'm not going to read through all of this, but clearly we are serving a different farmer, and this is really important when you think about the tools that a farmer wants. Today we know that everything we do is digital, everything we want to look at is on an app. The farmer wants to do the same, but you know, if you're a 65-year-old farmer for whom a cell phone is still a challenge, you know, digital tools to understand your farm are not so simple, but for a 35-year-old woman coming back to the farm who's technically savvy and has grown up with digital tools, it's a very different story. So that's the sort of social context for how we think about what we're serving in the future, but there's also a technology context. And there's two parts of what we think about the developing landscape for agriculture. And I'll touch on just a little bit of this in a couple of minutes, but first of all, it's in the context of tools like CRISPR that you heard about that we can use to improve crops in much better ways and more efficient ways than ever before. A series of genomics and crop growth models and synthetic biology, all these tools that can open up new opportunities, producing, for example, new and improved quality oils that are healthier for the consumer and maybe more efficiently used in terms of producing foods. We also think there's opportunities potentially to use technologies like genome editing to perhaps produce non-GMO products more broadly. The consumers seem to want non-GMO products for whatever reason, but that's something we have to recognize and look to serve. And there's a series of consumer benefits we can deliver with a series of biological capabilities. But there's also the digital capabilities that will shape the future. And so, the access to the cloud, mobile tools, ability to gather large amounts of data and analyze that data for patterns that can help a farmer make decisions on their fields, gives us the ability to provide a whole suite of tools for the farmer. So we acquired a company called Granular, Corteva did, about also just under 9 months ago. That is our first entry into the software business, the software for farmers. And so you can imagine a future in which farmers would have access to a tool like Zillow, where we can provide them an understanding of the value of their farm, how they can improve the value of their farm from how they farm, and then as they look around and want to maybe acquire or rent land, they can understand the best lands to rent for what purposes they have in mind. Just as an example of the kind of tools we can provide. We think also a nice analogy is the Google Maps. What's a Google Map? Well, it's your way that if you get lost, right, it gets you back on track. You got a plan, you know your destination, but if there's a traffic problem, the tool brings you back on track. Well, we can deliver to the farmer information about their farming year. And so 2 months into the year, it's not going quite the way they expected. We can give them a tool that gets them back on track to deliver the outcome they had intended for their farm. So there's a series of tools that we can provide them. So the farmers are our target. We can, because of a suite of tools that we have, we can offer the farmer a complete solution. And so that's the focus of this new company. It's not to provide the next fungicide or the next trait for controlling insects. It's to provide tools for the farmer to protect the farm from insect damage, or to protect it from disease, or to provide tools for simplifying what they produce. And so you can see here a suite of tools that we consider foundational to our ability to serve the farmer. Targeted breeding is how we think about genome editing as applied in breeding. It's a targeted form of breeding. And then digital solutions. I'm going to touch really quickly on those two because they're very germane to the relationship that we just announced in signing this agreement this morning between Corteva and Embrapa. So first, targeted breeding. We have what you might call conventional breeding of today is really digital breeding. Everything we do in breeding is done with digital tools. And I'm not going to spend time explaining the details behind that, but it enables us to continue to deliver improved yield for the crops that we breed in better and better ways. It also is the underpinning then for what we call targeted breeding. So we are now launching, you saw from Ibrahim, the CRISPR waxy. So the next generation waxy product is through targeted breeding, and we're going to bring that to the market within 4 years of the start of that product. So he mentioned how much more quickly this can happen. Typical breeding, 7 or 8 years. This product within 4 years of the start of that project, without any compromise in the evaluation of the product that we're delivering. But importantly, you can see a series of applications. And so we think of this tool as being very broadly applicable, both to what we might think of as the conventional sorts of improvements farmers want, disease resistance, yield, drought tolerance, but also to open up really new categories, to be able to modify protein or oil in ways that the consumer wants. And I think one of the interesting opportunities you can imagine is that at least there you can see in the US this desire for alternative proteins, alternative to meat, so whether that's dairy alternatives or meat alternatives. And if we can actually improve the proteins in, say, a soybean, we can actually deliver plant proteins that can be really effective in replacing some meat protein. So there's a lot of opportunity for this technology, and it is part of the foundation of some work we're going to do together with Embrapa, initially looking at opportunities like drought-tolerant soybeans, for example. And so we have been working very broadly. We have a sort of a technology base of our own, an intellectual property suite, but also a technology base, and we've reached out to foster the use of this technology in a range of places around the world, ICRISAT in India, SIMBIT in Mexico, the Danforth Center in the US, but serving Africa. We're enabled to do this through a mutual licensing agreement to bring CRISPR-Cas9 technology, make it available to anyone who wants to serve agriculture. And of course now we've added on the relationship with Embrapa that we think is really, really exciting to be able to bring some of the advantages of this technology into Brazil. And then digital solutions, just really quickly. Just going to open all that up. Whoop, well, I guess I'm not. Let's back up a second. So the bottom line here is that we can use data to really help us understand the relationship between the genetics of a particular variety in the crop and the phenotype that is manifest by that variety. And so that connection will enable us to breed more efficiently. It'll enable us to deliver better products to the farmer. And ultimately, we're starting with a suite of information that is disparate, but by using modern digital tools, we can actually bring that together, the genotype and phenotype, and ultimately be able to use that to create knowledge that's the underpinning of action for the farmer. So today you hear a lot about, there's great pictures you can take of your farm, but what do we do with that picture? It's kind of cool to put a drone up and take a photo, but what does a farmer do with that? And this is, again, part of what we're going to work on with Embrapa scientists in Brazil, is helping Brazilian farmers understand how to project how their soybean, let's just say, crop will grow through the year, and give them the tools to make real-time decisions about their farm. And we can actually have a sort of a simulation of their farm on the computer, where they can actually model what's going to happen to their crop during the season. And so this is one of the areas that we really believe is a vital opportunity for improving the bioeconomy in the future. And finally, what's that mean for the Brazilian farmer? Again, which is our fundamental mission and purpose in serving the farmer. First of all, it shows a commitment from Corteva as a new and emerging company to Brazilian agriculture. Improved performance under stress conditions, opportunities for better quality of food crops through targeted breeding, and then new digital tools to help farmers make better decisions, become more profitable, and at the same time, by understanding better what's happening on the farm, deliver a more sustainable outcome that society wants from that farmer. So thanks for Geraldo for organizing this today, and thanks for your time.
Marco, the floor is yours. So let's bring the Brazilian farmer now in cooperation with the U.S. farmer and see what they can do together to ensure global food security along with obviously other partners.
Thank you, Paulo. It's a big pleasure to come here again to the Woodrow Wilson Center. I've been participating in many events in the last 10 years, starting with the discussions about ethanol, biofuels, bioenergy, which is one of the big areas of potential cooperation between U.S. and Brazil. So what I'm going to do now, especially because I'm living in Asia, and now I see very much the huge potential that U.S. and Brazil have in Asia. Asia is the biggest market for us today, and I've been following the U.S.-Brazil story for a long time. Brazil, in some ways, have been following the U.S. agricultural revolution. The U.S. started much before us in the 19th century, beginning of the 20th century, with the colonization of the center-west of the U.S., the Midwest of the U.S., then all the movements of the land-grant colleges, the movements of infrastructure, irrigation, and you see everything that was done in this country, which was really marvelous. The big revolution of agricultural productivity of the 20th century, the beginning of the 20th century, was the U.S. And Brazil followed this after the 60s and 70s. Lots of Brazilians came to U.S., like you and many others, to study in U.S. I've been teaching 14 years at the School of Agriculture at the University of São Paulo, where we had probably 150 or 200 teachers coming to U.S. to do the PhDs here. I also lived here, working in this area. So what I see today is a huge potential cooperation between U.S. and Brazil, much more collaboration than you see competition. But this is not happening yet. So this is the idea of what I'm going to show you here. Is the potential for cooperation between the country that was the lead of the big agricultural revolution in the 20th century, which was the U.S., and what Brazil did after the 70s in tropical areas, because Brazil was really the leading country of increasing productivity in tropical areas, as was shown by Mauricio. So this is why agri-food sector is so important for Brazil. I'm going to focus on trade. Trade is my area, but I'm going to start from trade and then go to value chains and go to the message, the final message. So agri-food sector is really supporting the Brazilian trade balance for a long time, and this is exactly because of this possibility to export to the world and to follow the U.S. in many products and many cases and many countries. So today, the U.S. and the European Union are the top largest exporters of the world, growing 6-7% a year. And Brazil and China are just behind U.S. and the EU, growing 8-9% a year. Last year, in 2016, Brazil was number 4. In 2017, Brazil was number 3. So Brazil just surpassed China in 2017, as it happens before also. So we are really very close in terms of exports, Brazil and China. But let's make a comparison between Brazil and US, and this is very interesting. Brazil has been growing exports of agri-food products at 11% a year. The US is growing 7% a year. The US is, as I told you, number 2. Brazil is today number 3. But there's a difference here. The US is also a big importer of agricultural products and a very growing importer of value-added products. And Brazil doesn't import very much. So Brazil has a huge trade balance of almost $80 billion per year. And this is really sustaining the external accounts of the country. And the US has a lower trade balance because imports much more, especially value-added products, as I'm going to show you. The major products that are exported by Brazil, number 1 is soy, and that's why it's so interesting to see new possibilities for the usage of soy, because soy is the main vegetable protein in the world, and the big market we have today is China. US and Brazil have China as the big market. Now there's a discussion in the US-China relations about soybeans. I don't believe that soy will be the focus of the trade war because China is extremely dependent on soy from US, Brazil, and Argentina, as you know. So you see here in this graph that China represents 20 out of the $32 billion that Brazil exports in soybeans. And the rest of Asia, other $5 billion. So probably 80% of soy exports go today to China and to Asia. The rest of Asia, others Asia. Then we have number 2, meat sector. And this is basically chicken, pork, and beef, exported 50% to Asia, and then also to Middle East and to Europe. Now there's a discussion about Brazilian exports of chicken to Europe, etc., but it's very important here. Then sugar ethanol is Asia, Middle East, and Africa. Then we have all the other products, forests, coffee, tobacco, fruits. Actually, the Brazilian export balance, export list of products here, it's very interesting to see that just four chains, agri-food chains, just 4. Soybean, beef, meat, sugar, and forest represent 77% of Brazilian exports. So it's very, very concentrated in just a few agri-food chains, where Brazil is very important in terms of the trade, of the global trade in all those products. You see that coffee here is number 5. Coffee used to be number 1 for a long time. Brazil was a tropical exporter in the past. But after the revolution of the Cerrados, Brazil became, like the US, a big exporter of also products that were previously produced in the temperate climate. What the US is importing? The US is importing $120 billion, so it's huge imports, basically value-added products, starting by wine, beer, snack foods, processed fruits, and many other products. Brazil is not really selling to the US anymore because as we export commodities, we are focusing in Asia more than in the US. And also because the US is not very easy for our products, you see. We can sell value-added products to US as we see here, but when we try to sell sugar or chicken or beef is much more complicated. There's much more protection. The same happens in Brazil. I'm not saying that the US is is protecting those sectors. One of the reasons that we have a big trade balance is exactly because Brazil imports very little. And Brazil is a free trade country when it comes to exports, but when we talk about imports, our guys from, coffee or coconut or wheat or dairy or sectors that are importing, they are very resistant. Not to talk about ethanol or others, that it's also an issue. But let's see that Brazil and US have very little relations in terms of trade today, but they have a strong role in the world, very strong role, because we are among the 3 top largest exporters of the world. What are the US exports? And this is very interesting. What the US is exporting, $160 billion per year. The US is exporting number 1 product, soybeans, as Brazil, exactly like Brazil, and to China. Then we have forest products, corn, nuts, beef, pork, wheat. So what I did here is, let's put together only the products that are common for both countries, where we are in competition. And then, sorry, let me go here. And then those are the products, correct? We are talking about $100 billion of exports from the US, and we are talking about $80 billion of exports from Brazil in the same products, exactly the same products. Soy, forest products, corn and cereals. In Brazil is now growing the exports of corn, because Brazil is double cropping corn with soy, as you know. So there's a revolution right now in Brazil in the corn side, because we can produce a lot of corn in the same areas that we produce soybeans without irrigation. So Brazil is becoming an exporter of corn. Wheat, not yet, but Mauricio just mentioned that we are tropicalizing wheat, so if we do that, we could export wheat like the US. And then the rest, beef, both countries are very strong, poultry very strong, pork very strong. Orange juice are the 2 leading countries in the world, and cotton also, Brazil and the US are very important. So it's a very common list of products. So there's a lot of things to do in terms of cooperation on those products, on those commodities. And the other information that's important, we are focused in Asia. Look at the change of Brazilian exports from 2000 to 2017. China in 2000 represented 4% of our exports. Our exports at that time were $20 billion. Today they are $100 billion. And now China is 30%. So China moved from 4 to 30. Rest of Asia from 11 to 18. Africa from 3 to 8. Middle East from 5 to 10. And Europe reducing, US reducing. Europe reduced it from 43 to 18, US from 20 to 8. So it's a new geography. In 2000, the geography was, let's export to Europe and US. Let's negotiate in the WTO to eliminate subsidies in Europe and US. This was our target. Today, we needed to talk to Asia. And we needed to talk to Asia and to talk about how to solve huge problems they have, not only in food security, but also in food safety, in quality, in traceability, in many things that we mentioned here today. So there's a lot of cooperation here in Asia. And the US is going in the same direction, not as sharp as in Brazil, but you see the US exports to NAFTA are 28%. They were already 28% in 2000, so no big changes. What's changing in the US destination is, again, China and Hong Kong as destinations. So there's also, in this case, Asia receives 45% of US agri-food exports. Asia receives 48% of Brazilian agri-food exports. So both countries are today focusing in Asia. So then I am almost finishing, Paulo. I had one question here is, what's the concentration of exporters in the world? How many countries are really important on those commodities? Because the US represents probably 10% of world agri exports. Brazil represents 6%. But how much it is the representation in products such as soybean, corn, cotton, sugar, etc. So I put here 6 countries. Brazil, the partners of Mercosur, which is basically Argentina, but there's a small part to Paraguay and Uruguay. We have US in yellow, Australia in red, and Thailand in green. So in soybeans, Mercosur and US represent more than 70% of exports of grains, meal, and oil. In corn, 75%. In cotton, Brazil, US, and Australia represent 65%. In sugar, Brazil and Thailand, mainly 50%. In beef and poultry, almost 50%. So just a few countries that could be together in a small table, they represent a very important amount of exports in the world on those commodities, especially in soybeans, but also in corn, cotton, sugar, and meats. So why those countries do not talk more? See? Why those countries do not coordinate better in these world agendas, you see? So this is, in my opinion, the big challenge of the bioeconomy is not the agricultural revolution, but it's how to show the world that this is what we've been doing in countries like Brazil and US in the last decades, but this is also very important in other geographies, and we need to increase the integration of the food chains, because the food chains are still not very integrated. Countries are still looking for national solutions and not global solutions for most of the problems that were presented here. So just this is my final slide. When we talk about food chains, so now I'm going beyond the idea of the commodities and trying to develop the idea of the food chains, different drivers, different speeds. So Brazil and US have been very active in the area of food security. Food security is an area where productivity is the main challenge. Food security is very important in the poor countries, for the poor countries. Brazil is today a food secure country, US also for sure, but there's a lot of food insecure countries, especially in Africa and Asia. Countries that still have labor intensive agriculture, a very high number of small farmers, and the solution for those countries is, in one side, productivity, and on the other side, trade. And this is one agenda for Brazil and US. But this is not the only agenda. We have also in countries like, especially China, and many Asian countries, we have a challenge of food safety. In China today, food safety is more important than food security. By far, the big discussion in China, and I live there and I go to China every month, the big discussion in China is food safety. And that's why Paulo will probably in the future do another event just about food safety. This is one of the areas where Brazil and US should cooperate more. There's a lot to learn about the experiences in other countries and how to make it more efficient. So food safety means quality, healthy and fit and safe food, global players, value chain coordination, consolidation, traceability, etc. Value-added products. This is what's happening today there in Brazil. It's a big discussion about variety, branding, differentiation, convenience, ready-to-cook, ready-to-eat products, labeling, speed to market, food service. So this is the huge differentiation and value-added products that happens in the market. because Brazil and US are exporting just a few commodities, but at the end of the chain, you have thousands of products, and this revolution after the farm is the value-added, let's say, driver that's happening very strong in some countries. And you need to have this revolution, you need to have integrated food chains, which is an easy concept for us, Brazil and US. It's a difficult concept, especially in Asia and in Africa. The idea of integrated food chains from farmers to consumers in an efficient way, market access, etc. And finally, in very rich countries, including the US today, but also Europe, Japan, Korea, Singapore, there are new claims as a driver. New claims means, in many countries, less technology and not more technology, which is incredible, because in the beginning of the drivers, the first driver is we need productivity, we need technology. The end is we don't need technology. We want products that are local, antibiotics-free, GM-free, organic, veggie, bio, etc., etc. So this, low growth, etc. So individualized needs, emotional needs, environmental concerns, animal welfare. This is happening very strongly in Europe, for example, but also in all major cities of the world. This also happens in São Paulo, this happens in Beijing or in Shanghai. So when I put these waves, I'm not saying that the African countries are just in food security. I tried to do in a way that we show that in Africa you also have new claims, but the major preoccupation in African countries is food security. And in China is food safety, and in Brazil is value-added products, and in Europe is new claims, and all these new revolutions. So how to navigate on those food chains is a big challenge for us, no? So finally, putting together the US-Brazil challenge in terms of trade and the similarities we have, very similar stories and very similar trade patterns in terms of geography, in terms of products, in terms of productivity, in terms of lots of things. And the challenge of the integration of the value chains. What are the areas of cooperation that we should have? So first of all, the first area of cooperation is fighting global agriculture protectionism, which is still happening very strongly in the world, including in our countries too, but also in many countries today, and this today much more on the non-tariff barriers area. Then research and innovation in temperate and tropical conditions. Temperate, the US was the big revolution of the 20th century. In tropical conditions, I believe Brazil is the leading country. And the Brazilian experience has a lot to give to Africa, for example, especially to Africa, where we have similar conditions of production, but Africa is a net importer of almost everything. Modern ag technology, so everything that was mentioned here. Building globally integrated food chains, which they don't exist yet. What we have today is a partial supply chain, like soybeans. Soybeans is the good example. We are sending soybeans from the Americas to China to feed chicken and pork in China in a way that's not as efficient as we do. So is this the best solution, or the best solution would be integrate more the food chain and go beyond the feed to food and from food to consumers, correct? To end consumers, so not only food processing, but also food consumption. Production systems, we have similar stories in terms of costs, productivity, contract farming, land use, and economies of scale. The history of the Midwest of the States was the expansion. 100 years ago, the history of the Brazilian center-west is the same expansion of people moving from south to center-west, from low scale to higher scale. So it's very similar production systems. Food safety, quality, traceability, this, I leave to Paulo next seminar about this. I think it's extremely important. Sustainability is the big message we have today there in Brazil. We are focusing, Embrapa is focusing, the Ministry of Agriculture is focusing in the message that Brazil is doing the right job in terms of sustainability and climate smart agriculture and low carbon production, etc. Bioenergy, also huge area of cooperation. The two leading countries in biofuels are Brazil and US. And probably the one that's most important of all is communication, because we communicate very badly what's happening. So this kind of event here, we should do in many different countries. There's a lot of misperceptions about Brazil and US sometimes, and we should do more communication. So this is, in my opinion, the big international cooperation agenda of our countries. Thank you, Paulo.
Well, thank you. I'd like to open the floor for questions. We have a few observations, and Geraldo can help us with that. But would you have questions, observations to our speakers, or if the speakers also can comment on? But go ahead. Identify yourself, please, so the speakers know. Okay, first there and then here.
Doug Faulkner, president of Leatherstocking, a clean tech advisory firm. An observation or two and a question about terminology and focus. My perspective on the bioeconomy really was maybe old-fashioned, but it's really about bioenergy. That perspective was formed back in the George W. Bush administration when, as a senior political at Energy and Agriculture, we were helping to build a brand new partnership with Brazil. It was short-term, I guess, in the end, but in this area to expand bioenergy production worldwide. Politics and other things sort of played a role in that, in the changing of that, but there was a lot of debate in the interim on food versus fuel, which I think has been shown to be a false debate in many ways, but it's really food and fuel. But now there's more and more focus, I think, on the connection between energy and food. And I'm working with the Johns Hopkins University School of Advanced International Studies to promote a new initiative to launch, to promote global bioenergy production and linked in with ag modernization. So maybe Marcus and Mauricio in particular, but anybody else, could talk about how all of this relates, this food and pharmaceutical, to the security in those areas with energy security and where we might be going in the 21st century. Marcus, you were kind of ending there on a new partnership sort of theme, but maybe you could address that if there's if we're in a new era for a new type of partnership in bioenergy and food production.
Yeah, let me ask, let's get 2 or 3 questions and then go.
Yes, I'm Dr. Sam Hancock of Emerald Planet TV, and thanks to each of you. This is very enlightening about all this research that's going on and where we're going in the future. But this is to Dr. Lopez and the work that's going on in Brazil. How do we communicate to a greater public? You know, we have an international television program, but, you know, that's one channel, and there are many other channels that we need to use to get this information out. That Brazil really may be the right path, even for what's going on in the United States and Europe, which are major agricultural producing areas. But in a way, it's very sustainable, because I think this is the misconception of the public over what you said is, how is this really sustainable, and how is this really going to take care of the food, the fuel, and the fiber for the balance of this century as we move into actually we're already looking at the 22nd century and where we're going. And I think that's where we need to be looking. But thank you for what you've shared.
Geraldo, anybody else? Oh, there is one question there.
Hi, I'm Jessie Stolark with the Environmental and Energy Policy Institute, and my question is more on U.S. policy and sort of, it's very germane. Actually, today the House will be considering the Farm Bill, and there's actually an amendment to completely eliminate the energy title, which in the United States is one of the main drivers of the development of the bioeconomy. And so my question is, maybe for Neil or others of you on the business side, how do we convince U.S. policymakers that these things are important? And do you see policy as being a major driver in the United States? Is it driving away business, or are you sort of looking at other kind of strategies for investment? And I'm just kind of wondering how you're dealing with this uncertain policy environment.
Well, go ahead. Mauricio.
Well, thank you. Yes, in a few years back, people would think that the main opportunity for us as we migrate into this concept of bioeconomy, a low impact, a low carbon economy, would be through bioenergy. So bioenergy was has been for many years a big thing in Brazil. I think it was the first entry point of Brazil into the bioeconomy, our production of ethanol that helped Brazil move to the position of a country with the most renewable energy matrix in the world. It was basically due to our effort in the ethanol industry, but not only that, Brazil is also a huge producer of energy from hydropower, and it also helps our country. But today we are looking at possibilities in bioeconomy well beyond energy made out of biomass. I personally think that we are just in a transition from biomass energy to other forms of energy which are becoming more and more feasible economically, wind and solar energy. I find it as we move into the possibility of distilling from biomass, basically everything you can distill or can take from petroleum. It's a bit sad to see us breaking down very complex molecules that nature took zillions of years to conceive and to make it possible to produce in large amounts, just to break it down to produce fuel to burn. I think we will have a transition into a more sophisticated use of biomass. I think we have to think about biofactories. I would like to see a future in which Brazil uses the huge capacity that we have today to handle biomass in large scale with a very sophisticated logistics to extract a lot more from that biomass. That's the future I would like to foresee for the biomass industry in Brazil. And to us today, bioeconomy is offering a lot more, the possibility for us to have food production certified as low carbon or zero carbon food, as I showed you with beef. The possibility for us to enhance our capacity to protect our huge natural resource base. Brazil has still 66% of its territory covered with natural forest, and still Brazil is pointed at and called a country that is not sustainable, that it has a predatory ways of producing food, which is not true. It brings me to the second question. Our challenge of devising a narrative and a communication strategy to show all the huge efforts that our country is making in public policy and mobilizing the best science so that we have a paradigm of production that is able to dialogue with the expectations of society, essentially what Marcus Janka showed. So what we are doing is to try to develop a platform food and agricultural products production in order to dialogue with this the current and the emerging reality. That's why Embrapa is looking for ways to merge its agenda of research and innovation with the 2030 agenda from the UN, because we think that that is a good driver. That will help us build a new narrative, and I hope also a new way to communicate to the world what we've been doing. And we are doing great things in terms of bringing our production closer to sustainability and closer to the emerging trends and expectations of modern society.
Okay, thanks for the question. I think that the biofuels agenda, we should separate the first and second generation. So on the first generation, we had a huge story in Brazil, long story of ethanol as an additive to gasoline, but also as a substitute with the flex fuel cars. In the last 10 years, in the last 5 years, Brazil had a crisis. And in the last 10 years, the US raised productivity a lot. And this is, in my opinion, a very good example that even if we have the fantastic plant like sugarcane, we cannot stop research, because this is what's happening today in corn. Corn has been raising productivity a lot. But we know that the future is not first generation only ethanol. We need to move to second and third generations, which is what Maurice was saying here. And the big challenge is to produce ethanol from cellulose, from non-food materials, because then you don't have the same criticism that we have today on the first generation. I've been following this story in Asia, and it's interesting because they want to have ethanol, but they don't want to use traditional food commodities to do that. So, for example, China right now is trying to have a E10 program because they want to use the big stocks of corn they have. They have big stocks of more than 200 million tons of corn, and they want this to produce ethanol, but they don't want to use corn forever. They just want to eliminate those stocks, which are old stocks with low quality. But then they want to move directly to cellulose. But we know that there is still a cost problem when it comes to produce ethanol from cellulose. So that's why research is so important, and that's why Brazil and US are very well placed to lead this revolution, especially by the private sector. So I really believe that this should be a very strong concern is to produce biofuels from cellulose, and not only fuels, but also electricity and other energies. So this is the big challenge. In terms of the sustainability versus agriculture production versus sustainability, I think there is a problem of communication here, because when you have countries that have been raising productivity so much as it happens to Brazil and to US in general in agriculture, this is the best sustainable policy you can have to avoid the deforestation. Yesterday you presented at the event that we were, this number about 200 million hectares that were saved in each country. 200 million hectares saved in Brazil and 200 million hectares in US in corn and soy. Major crops over the past 60 years because of productivity gains. So saving land because we had a huge increase in productivity. So this is a very basic issue. It seems very simple for us from Brazil and US, but it's not simple in many countries. Many countries do not have a revolution because they resist to technology in some ways. For example, there's a huge resistance to GMOs in many countries, which means that these countries are not going to have the same gains of obviously productivity. And the second issue is the actions like the forest code in Brazil, which is a very Brazilian way to to deal with this problem, asking farmers to keep at least 20% of the farm with forests. So Brazil has this forest code today. There's a lot of people that like, there's people that are still criticizing, but this is the best system in tropical areas today. If we don't have this, in many tropical countries, what we see today is completely uncontrolled deforestation. So it's better to produce in Brazil under high productivity and forest code than block Brazil and say, let's do this in Africa, for example. Then you don't have a rule, and you don't have a forest code, and you don't have productivity, which means that this will not solve the food problems. So that's why I believe we should always remember that sustainability is not just the environment concerns, but it's environment, economic, and social issues together. It's very complicated. But then we needed to know who is doing the right job in the right way. And then we needed to communicate that. And I believe that Brazil and US are countries that are not communicating very well. Normally we hear much more from Europe in this area than from the Americas.
Yes, maybe we need to hire more writers to develop the narrative. Journalists, for instance. But please, on the question on the role of the private sector in the policy.
Yeah. I mean, maybe, you asked some specific questions about the Farm Bill, and I'm not going to get into the Farm Bill today. No surprise, probably. But, it's sort of very clear that policy and regulatory paradigms are very much shape what we can do, and it really comes back to, is technology going to be used or not? I was at a meeting last summer in California. It was about, CRISPR and genome editing, and there was a reception from the U.S. Soybean Board, and one of the growers said, 20 years ago when Roundup, weed control first came out, farmers thought it was a great technology, and they used it. There wasn't a lot of debate about it. Today, if a farmer wants to adopt something new, the first question is, will the market accept it? And so, it's sort of simple, but it's different than it was 20 years ago, and so it means that we have to be ever more involved in, policy and social and regulatory dialogues. An example of the application of a tool like CRISPR for, modern crop improvement, that is a technology I would have, loved to see 30 years ago. It's been, part of my career has been trying to help that come to fruition, and here we are at the cusp of some tremendous opportunities where a technology actually can address needs that we hear from consumers today. It's not a technology looking for a solution. It happens to be there's problems out there, and this technology just naturally will address some of those. But without the right policy frameworks, and actually it's more than policy, it's the public acceptance and perception of those technologies, which maybe comes back to journalism and communications. The consumers won't get the benefit of those technologies. So, we, as Corteva, obviously are very committed to engaging globally with regulators and governments around, listening, engaging, in some cases trying to help explain the technologies we use. And I think the comment from the USDA about fundamentally seeing that there is no unique risks to the technology, that's a pretty important statement. It isn't just a regulatory statement, it's a safety statement. And fundamentally, whatever level of respect the world has for its regulators and faith in them, when regulators do say something like that, that's useful and important. So it's good to see, certainly.
Okay, Geraldo, I think you have...
I have a few questions here, a list. Thank you so very much for the wonderful presentations. I really enjoy it. And very quickly, to Barry, you mentioned about using some major crops and eventually moving towards other crops. Is there a specific desirable profile of seed for these non-major crops? What should we look for in looking for other alternatives, for example, to soybean? Pretty much this is the question. To Ibrahim and Marcos, as of today, how new breeding technologies will affect and will be affected in terms of trade and regulation in terms of barriers, trade barriers, non-trade barriers. This is interesting to put in perspective. We have those new breeding technologies coming up. How this might affect this trade relationship and also in terms of regulation. To Neil, regarding farmers' demand in the US and Brazil, are they quite similar or are there regional specificities worth of highlighting? And to Mauricio, what will be the major role or the major challenge for a public agricultural research organization in this evolving bioeconomy era? More focusing on the research perspective, perhaps not in the agricultural sector perspective.
We start with Ibrahim.
Gerald, thank you for the question. I think, as I stated in my presentation, I think the Secretary's statement on this very topic of genome editing was basically one step forward in communicating where we stand on this technology as it relates to the products of genome editing, edited crops or products. And I think this is something that is, I'm not aware of any product that's already in the marketplace, but I think this is something we have been proactive in our approach to communicating with our trading partners. We are communicating with, there were several meetings already that have taken place in this year and in the past 2 years as well, to talk about this technology and how this might be where we collectively as countries that will be developing this product and countries that will be buying these products on how we should be dealing with this as we began to see these products in the market. It's, as I stated, we need to continue to communicate that openly and transparently. We have started, this is the fact that we have been publishing online our decisions on some of these products. I think it's one designed to basically assure the public that these products are as any other products when it comes to safety, and we ensure that we have basically done our analysis on science-based and decisions that can basically assure us collectively as consumers and traders that we can be comfortable with some of these products.
Go ahead.
The question about trade barriers, regulation and trade barriers. In general, to export grains and beans is easier than to export meat, for example, animal protein, correct? But even if you are in the grain side, you have a lot of protection. For example, there's protection in corn in terms of high tariffs and tariff rate quotas. In soybeans, there is protection to value adding. So countries, for example, China is buying soy grains, soybeans, but it's not buying soy meal and soy oil because they use tariff escalations, and some countries, to compensate tariff escalations, they use differential export taxes like Argentina does today. Argentina is forcing to export meal and oil because they compensate the escalations, higher import tariffs for value added with higher domestic export taxes. You see, so it's a complicated system, but it happens. But in terms of the technology, what you see here is a resistance to using GMs, for example. So China, for example, there is a complicated process of approval of varieties that touches a lot the companies today. And also many other countries have also strong resistance GM products. But what's interesting in the process of the consolidation of the industry is that in one side you have the consolidation of two US big companies like DuPont and Dow. But on the other side, you have a consolidation between Monsanto and Bayer. Bayer is a German company which is by Monsanto. And on the other side, you have Syngenta, which is today a Chinese company. So for me, this is a signal that China will move to biotech very, very shortly, even if they are resisting today. And the only way that they have to move fast to more productivity in agriculture is to accept GM, especially in corn. And they are now eliminating their stocks of corn because they want to change the regulation in the corn market. And this will come together with, in my opinion, more biotech in China.
As far as picking a seed crop, here, I'm sorry, bring this a little closer. The issues were when we produced in soy, this was very productive, and you were able to dry them, and you were able to get multiple products out of the same seed. And because soy had been used for, centuries as a food crop, any of the other ingredients in the soy seed are generally on the generally regarded as safe list, the GRAS list. So for pharmaceutical purifications and things, and for utility, that's a significant advantage. So if I were to select a seed, you could, for example, if there was a variety of soybean that happened to be purple, so is easily identifiable, you need to have some, and this is a different, aspect of food surety than what you were discussing. People want to have the surety that this seed could not contaminate other foodstuffs. So either you have to have an easily identifiable soybean seed that's been engineered otherwise so that it can't easily corrupt other food sources, or you pick a seed that is less used, also on the GRAS list, that you could work to encourage new biotools and new genetic engineering approaches to that seed to use it more exclusively for biopharmaceuticals.
The oil content wouldn't be an issue.
Excuse me?
The oil content.
The oil content, it depends on what sort of secondary products you want. I think because biopharmaceuticals could be extracted potentially from these, ideally you should have a second product in mind when doing so. In this case, because oil was a second product and potentially a third product could be out of the proteins that were left, depending upon GMO acceptability, then you could have multiple products. I think that will help. As Mauricio was saying, to break down everything to make smaller and smaller commodity products out of very complex chemistry produced by plants is maybe not as advantageous as perhaps using these plants to make more complex chemistry and higher value products that could be used, while at the same time having the remains of that seed crop be used for commodities. And so I think, I suggested this to my colleagues at the USDA and at EPA and FDA earlier. There's a plant and animal genome meeting where they have, generally everyone comes to discuss their genetic engineering. If you want to be proactive, then you need to start getting the scientists who are mostly involved in this working together and decide, okay, we are going to support this research, come up with plant species that would be suitable.
The conversation? Final, sure. So two things. One, just about the sort of the policy and regulation around genome editing, edited crops, let's say, around the world. We've seen the disruption that's created by, non-concordant regulations around the world. Ideally, we'd get to some place where there's some reasonable harmonization of the way different countries approach regulations. And one of the opportunities of partnering with Embrapa is to help continue to foster that sort of similar view and communication about the technology between Brazil and the U.S., which is very positive. And it's not the only answer. It's not just a piece of the answer, but clearly important. On the farming side, when I think about the difference in how we serve farmers in Brazil or the U.S., clearly the policy and social environment has an impact on that. But I think, it's really more about size and type of farming practices that make a difference, right? So large farmers, have much more common challenges than small farmers. And so when we think about how we segment how we serve farmers, it's more about those kinds of issues. If you're a 2-hectare rice farmer versus a 10,000-hectare soybean farmer, that's the different issue, not as much the location. And that will matter, right? I mean, an early adoption of new tools will tend to go to the larger farmers to start with, early adopters of technology, things like that. So.
Thank you very much.
Yes, before I answer the question of Geraldo in relation to the public sector, let me say just a few words, allow me, Barry, in relation to the production of this, like CyanoByron in soybeans. One big concern is related to gene flow. I mean, you are not going to use a plant in a country that has lots of wild relatives of that plant, because it grows a lot the risk of the gene that you have inserted to produce something completely, entirely new in that grain, flowing to wild relatives and dispersing eventually to other species. Just to assure you that it was tremendously safe to do it in Brazil with soybeans, because there are no wild relatives of soybeans in Brazil. So zero, the possibility of the gene inserted in that soybean material flowing or spreading to any wild relative or any wild plant in Brazil. So in a way, soybean is a good species to do that kind of work in a country like Brazil, if you can assure containment. And we have all the technology to assure containment, since we are not going to produce thousands and thousands of hectares of this modified plant. It's not necessary. So you can design the containment strategy to assure that the product will be contained, or the gene will be contained. So just this extra information that is important, I think. Well, in relation to the public sector, I always like to say that public research is like the cleaning track train. We have the responsibility to produce public goods. We had the responsibility to embrace the biggest challenges. We have the responsibility to do more strategic thinking, to look ahead, because there are many, many challenges that will not be embraced by the private sector for very obvious reasons. So the private sector is looking at the market, you have to look at profits, you have to look at your investors and everything else. So it's our responsibility to put together the best strategic thinking, to look 5, 10, 15, 30 years ahead, to embrace the most challenging projects. The long term usually are embraced by the public sector. And if you don't have a public sector engaged in research and innovation, maybe you will not be able to tackle or to anticipate or to prepare the country for the challenges that are coming or that are in the horizon. So I always like to say that the public sector is the cleaning track train. We go in front, ahead, anticipating, embracing huge challenges, cleaning the tracks so that the private sector can find the tracks cleaned, so that you can go ahead and produce the employment and all the things that the society needs. Just to give you an example, this integrated crop livestock system that we developed in Brazil, it was started 30 years ago. My colleagues that started that, they were called crazy people. What crazy thing is this, to combine crop with livestock and forestry in the same space? This looks like a crazy thing. But now we have the emergence of this low carbon, low impact, the bioeconomy. It makes all sense to have a zero carbon production system. And this idea of 30 years ago is emerging with a major force in Brazil. We have simply 14 million hectares of integrated systems in Brazil because somebody embraced the challenge. Somebody was able to foresee this challenge many years ago and to produce public goods, information, and a base to help us move forward. To finish, Paulo, I think this discussion, it shows us very clearly that we are immersed in an era of complexity. We have many complex challenges to overcome. Marcus told us about all the complex challenges that we have to make our value chains merge, to be managed in a more integrated and intelligent way, many challenges. And to deal with complexity, you need two things, two key ingredients. You need information, knowledge, and for that you need good science. But that is not necessary because one organization without the knowledge will not be able alone to solve the problems. You need, together with good information and knowledge, you need relations. We have to build relations to face the challenge, the challenges that are here now, the complexity that is here now, and the complexity that is emerging in the horizon. And I think that's the nicest thing about this event. That's the possibility for us to share our knowledge and to build and to make our commitments and our relations even stronger. And this is the way for us to face the challenges and the complexity that is emerging in this world we live in. Thank you, Paulo, for your support to this great event.
Thank you very much, all of you, Mauricio, Neil, Barry, Ibrahim, Marcus, for providing us a great description of this very complex world, but probably a hopeful one. Geraldo, thank you very much for your cooperation and for bringing this event to us. I would like to recognize our program associate, Anya Prusa, our interns, Carly Rogers and Andrew Allen. It would not have happened without them. And I'm very appreciative of that. And just to end on underlining what you just said in terms of, we have faced in Brazil enormous challenges recently on the economic side, on the political side, on the ethical side. We are not alone in that. I happen to be a dual citizen of Brazil and the United States, and I feel the pain of the two countries. But I think it's very important to keep highlighting this story of cooperation. We are talking about food security, we are talking about food safety, we are talking about low carbon economy, we are talking about, it's a good story. And Brazil and the United States Brazil and the United States have the opportunity, and I would say even more, having the responsibility of doing the right thing. With that, I thank you very much, and I wish you a very good afternoon.